let's chat a little bit about Yuca. And just for the listener, if you're not already subscribed to the Petty Herbalist podcast, you'll know Karina and Asia have been on the show twice now. They've got a show called the Petty Herbalist podcast where they interview Brandon. I want to say you talked to them about Yuca for maybe 30 minutes or so, but we don't have that time right now today. Also, Brandon, on occasion, I want to say, has a full 2-hour class on that as well, which you could probably sign up for in the future. So, again,
Yeah.
follow Brandon on Instagram. But why don't you tell us, first of all, also, I got to say, I randomly saw it at the grocery store and I was like, oh shit, Brandon talks about this sometimes. So I did buy it. And now it's one of our quasi staple foods. And Amanda absolutely adores when I make yuca. So let's just hear about your love of yuca, maybe some of the benefits and what you like to do with it.
Yeah, totally. Yucca has definitely become, I'm thinking that actually the only tattoo I have is of
That's
yucca.
legit.
So,
Nice. I got
um,
dandelion on mine.
nice, nice.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the spot, right? I was like, how do I show that?
That's right.
Um, but yeah, yucca is definitely kind of like I mentioned, even in the terminology of like yucca farms, right? Like yucca
Mm,
is considered a staple, even spiritually, as like an embodiment of yucahu, which is
mm,
what I don't think it would be worded as a deity or a god within Taino religion, but what's described as a semi,
wow.
which is basically like you would see these they're called trigononitos, which are basically these like triangle pointed stones with the face on it, and it represents a summit in Puerto Rico specifically that was considered where Yucahu would live. Yucahu would govern the farming of yucca, the fertility of the soil, harvests, and things like that. So in that sense, it's been a very spiritual connection as well as feeding people for so long.
Mm,
And yucca was one of the first things that I really started to cultivate to like personify growing culturally relevant crops and Caribbean crops. Though it is something native to the Americas, so traditionally the Arawakan people have basically brought it from modern day like Amazonas, like the Orinoco River Valley of Venezuela, modern day, into the Caribbean and then cultivated it. Yucca at one point was brought by the Portuguese to Western Africa in about the 1600s. And even now, I think Nigeria is the biggest producer of yucca in the world now.
oh, wow.
Yucca is found everywhere throughout the world in the tropics and subtropics. Um, it's a starchy root. Traditionally, within Caribbean culture, we will eat the root boiled, fried, mashed. In other parts of the world, especially West Africa, the ingenuity of like what is done with yucca is crazy. They make like gari, which is basically like toasting down the smaller bits of it. They've made basically, yucca flour, which you can use like any other flour. Yucca, all sorts of things. So there's a lot of different ways to make it. One of the sort of interconnected ways of using yucca is for making a dish called cassave, which
Mm,
varies in how it's prepared or what the name might be. But cassave, Casabe, because a lot of times you also see it called cassava.
yep. I've seen
Um,
that.
Cassave is basically grated down yucca that is then pressed out of it's pressed out of thing that has many different names. Sometimes it's called a cebucan. It's like palm fiber woven thing that's pretty long, and when you sit on it and apply the pressure, it squeezes all of the juice out because yucca actually is toxic raw. And so it presses all the water content out. And then from there, that's all sifted through and it's cooked on a flat cooking surface to make what sometimes people call it cassava bread. It's definitely
Mm,
different than bread. It's basically, very finely broken down yucca into a piece that I would say is more cracker-like and crunchy, but it's does not spoil very easily. It's created the basis for a lot of foodways throughout the Caribbean. And you can see it reflected, especially like how it's made. That
mm,
idea of grating, putting it in a woven basket and squeezing it out and then cooking it flat. You can see all throughout Central America, all throughout the Caribbean, all throughout South America, through different tribes and cultures. So that's like kind of the consensual way to prepare that dish. Um, and I've tried to incorporate it more into everyday life. You don't need like all of that, so to speak, to do
right.
it at home. It's cool too, for
Yeah.
sure. But straining it, cheesecloth, pressing it out, cooking it over the surface, and making that sort of base in soups or with fish or whatever else it is really good. It's pretty flavorless, but it definitely carries things. At the grocery store, you can find like a garlic flavor or a
Hmm.
black pepper flavor, things like that. And so that's one of the ways that ancestrally is, a very specific way to prepare it. But yuca, boiled yuca, fried yuca, there's different things, especially in Puerto Rican culture, that when we make the masa or like the batter, so to speak, for things like pateles, which is basically like, I don't want to compare it to a tamale, but it's basically wrapped in banana leaves, different
Hmm.
starches grated down, filled with meat, wrapped up, and then boiled. Um, Things like that, and a couple other dishes that off the top of my head are gone. I can taste them, but I can't think of. But it's really the basis for a lot of culinary development in the Caribbean, especially, and other parts of the world where I've heard of people using yucca root and some of the starch and compounds for making some sort of biodiesel.
Oh wow.
Heard of, and another name for yucca is tapioca. Tapioca, boba, things like that. That all comes from yucca. It comes from the starch in it. Um, and so it's made an imprint in so many different parts of the world. And for me, I think it's really cool to observe a plant with all of its cultural context, whether that's within the Caribbean, because we might have a plant that an island over, and there's plenty of examples of this. Like we might have a plant we use only the berries, but in Jamaica they use only the leaves. And so
Hmm.
this cross-cultural sort of idea and connection of understanding how these plants work, I think is really important for how we relate to plants. And then in the world scheme of things, there's just hundreds of ways to prepare it. So that was like a really roundabout way to explain it without being like, all right, don't stop there, keep going. Talk for a while.
You did a
Yeah.
great job. How many times a week do you consume it, would you say?
It depending on like what I have, not what I have going on, but I've been a little all over the place recently, so I
Sure.
haven't as much. I
Yeah.
did get some the other day, and so I
Yeah.
just boil it, and then
Okay.
after that, I might fry it. I really like. There's a dish called jibaritos, which is
Oh
I don't know
yeah.
if you tried. It's
I
basically
haven't, but I when I visited when I picked up my daughter in Chicago, there was a restaurant there that was selling jibaritos, and
mm,
I was really bummed that we they were closed.
yeah.
So I didn't
Oh
get to
man,
try it, but I was like, damn, I really want to have that. But you
yeah,
were saying, I want to say in the Petty Herbalist podcast that instead of using, was it plantain, they're using yucca root. Is that right?
yeah. That's a really awesome. It's another starch that can be fried and made into a crispy thing that's considered the bun. So. Yeah, a
Yeah.
lot of
So
different.
when we make it in our household, all we've really done is made like a mashed, like a boiled and mashed version of it, and it'll have like that those stringy fibers in it. And I was just kind of curious from an expert's perspective, is that's just normal, right? That's to be
Yeah,
expected.
there's
Okay.
a fiber that goes straight through the middle, and usually when you cut it, if you cut it in half and then in quarters, you can kind of get that out.
Yeah.
It usually makes it a lot. It always just depends though, because I'll cook yuca in a place where it's really fresh.
Yeah.
I think that it can develop a little more fibrousness, or that core fiber can get a little more dispersed and
Mm.
then get into other parts of it when it's shipped. Because when we get yuca from the grocery store, yuca spoils very fast. I've harvested yuca
Oh,
in a day and a half, it's rotten.
wow.
And so what they do is they cover it in that wax that stops that process from going, and then they ship it. And so usually that wax is not there. It's just a regular bark, which if you cut lightly into it and sort of pop it under, you can basically go around the whole root and take it off really easy.
Mm.
But that's the basis part of it, because I've harvested it before, and talked with. I remember I harvested it one time, the first time I grew it in Charlotte, and I talked with the chef, and he was like, if you could deliver it Saturday. It was Wednesday, and I was like, you're gonna have to get it today or tomorrow, because at that point, it's a
Yeah.
type of, I don't know if it's exactly dormant in the root, but if you cut a yucca open or you leave it on the counter, it gets too old. There are these black lines and dots inside of it. And it's a form of a fungus basically that gets inside of it. It's not that it's completely toxic, but it really messes with the integrity of like how it cooks. And it'll get
Mm.
firm, and it'll start to like fissure and open up. And I just in Costa Rica going, I'll have like just boiled roots, and it's so tender and fluffy. And then I come back here and I have it. I'm like, oh, this is. could be better.
Wow, I had no idea. Yeah, I thought that wax was maybe borderline natural or something. It's so
What
hardy
that
when you buy it from
develops
the
on it.
store.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, and we just like cut it in little pieces and then we use a knife to shave off the outside layer. Is that kind of what you do too, or do you use like a potato peeler?
You could do that. The potato peeler, I think, is a lot harder, but you
Yeah.
could try this when
Yeah.
I cut it into pieces like that
Yeah.
each. And then if I have it where like the exposed part is the top and this is like the bark on the outside, I'll use a knife and just barely cut it. And when you pop it under, it's like eighth of an inch of a little bit of bark around it, and you can
Oh,
slide the knife under and peel the whole thing clean.
gotcha.
That bark on it is like a little thin layer that comes off really easily. But you could also I just think the wax from the markets makes it harder to cut it sideways like that, you know?
Okay.